how to determine what test cases to run against code or procedures that we write?
So this is a tough question. Figuring out how to test code is something that requires a lot of experience, and it's something we will have an entire course on software testing fairly soon. The way to think about testing is definitely to think about what all the inputs are. So any procedure has infinitely many inputs, so you definitely can't try them all. And that means you need to think about the different kinds of inputs. And boundary cases are usually good things to test for. So if the inputs are things like strings, the boundary case is an empty string. So you might want to test the procedure with an empty string, with a long string, with some other strings. If it's something where the content of the string matters, like the find last question from homework 2, well, then you've also got to think about different kinds of content in the string, where maybe there's no matches at all, where there's lots of matches, where there's one match. So it's definitely requires some creativity to think of all the boundary cases and test them, but that's really what you're trying to do, is to think of all the things that might make your code behave differently, and all the things that maybe if you didn't think about them, your code wouldn't behave correctly for.
Yeah, boundary cases are a good place to start. Make sure, even if you think your procedure will only take in negative numbers or positive. I mean, if you think your procedures only takes in positive number, it doesn't hurt to design the case where it handles things outside the
Right,
bounds.
and often for the homeworks for this class, we're trying to specify fairly limited sets of inputs that you have to think about, that it only has to work for positive integers. But as you're writing code, especially if you write code that goes up on the web, you have no control over what inputs people send to it. So that's often where the problems happen, not thinking about
We
those
plan on
cases.
trying to be as clear as possible in the future what kind of inputs one can expect. That was something we could have done better on early on. We try to make sure there's nothing surprising in there, but sometimes...
There were some tricky test cases for definitely the find last question.
Yes,
homework
find
too,
last
that
had
had
some...
trickier test cases than might have been fair for that one.
Yes,
so
yes,
that caused some difficulty.
Probably shouldn't have tested empty strings.
Right, testing the empty string.
I mean, what it does is even kind of undefined when you're searching for an empty string in an empty string.
Right, and one of the error cases for that was your code runs forever. There were lots of pretty close solutions to this, that on the empty string example, your code would run forever, which unfortunately the way the server is working now made it look like you couldn't tell the difference between that and when the server was down. So that definitely was not the ideal way for that question to work.
We had a lot of people join.
We have many people joining. Who has a question?
Well, I've got a question.
Okay.
Go for it.
Yes. Yeah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Do you guys have public enrollment numbers and how many are in each course? A bunch of people asked in the forums.
Yeah, so we've seen this question, and we understand people wanting to know these numbers. We are a little reluctant to release them, and we actually don't have numbers specific for courses right now. And part of the reluctance to release them is, there is a lot of noise about sort of numbers of students enrolled in classes. And those really aren't the numbers that we care about or that we should care about. And if people start competing for numbers of students in courses, that's really measuring the wrong thing. And it's sort of the same reason that in the early days on Google search engine, they said the number of pages they indexed on the web, and they keep increasing that number and having, we've indexed billions and billions of pages. And then other search engines started competing by trying to have higher numbers. And then Google decided to remove that it's not a good measure of how good a search engine is, just the number of pages you index. And if your goal is to increase that number, there are lots of ways to index more pages that make your search engine worse, that you're indexing the same page multiple times. So it's actually quite hard to get an accurate count of how many people are really taking the class. And we want to do that. We're trying to figure out good ways to do that. But we want to be a little careful not to release meaningless numbers just based on the number of email addresses we have or the number of people that come to a website.
I mean, the answer to your question is right now we don't really know.
Okay. Will that be something you'll figure out once the course ends and kind of track how
We'll
many
probably
people-
get it
We'll definitely know at the end of the course how many people completed the course, and I think
That's probably
we'll
the most
release that
meaningful
number. That'll be something. That's really in terms of what matters to us is the number of students that are getting a lot of value out of the course, and we should have those numbers at the end of the course, and I think I'd certainly like to release them. I think we'll be able to. At this point, we don't really have a meaningful number that we can release.
And the course isn't over yet. I mean, we've only had.
And we still have new students joining.
Yeah.
And we hope that new students will keep joining and still be able to catch up in the course.
So we have a text question. Some debugging topics. So.
Okay, so there's a text. Can they see the text question? All right, I'll mention. So this is from YDNAYABA. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. If they're actually here, maybe they can tell us. And the question is about, could we cover some debugging topics and approaches in the recorded office hours? And that's definitely an important question, is how do you debug code? And I think it's pretty hard to learn debugging. So the best way I can think of to learn debugging is to do things so you can observe what your code's doing. So to figure out what's wrong, often just printing out what's going on to see, if as the problems get more complex, like they did in homework 2, there are many stages along the way. The way to debug is to test each stage one part at a time. And that could be done just with prints. If you print out what you want to be there, you can check that. You have to be careful to remember to remove those prints when you submit the homework, at least for problems where the goal is to print something out. That will prevent it from being graded correct if you forget to remove them. But just to do things where you're really thinking like a detective, that you're trying to do observations and set up things where you can learn as much about what's going right and what's going wrong about your code to isolate what the problem is. Figure out, be confident that this is correct, and then you're looking at the next step. Often where things take the most time is when you assume the first step's correct and spend all your time trying to figure out what's wrong with the second step, but really the first step wasn't correct and the second step was fine. So that's where being careful and testing as you go and doing things in small steps is really what makes it easier. And as the problems get more complex, it's really necessary to break them out.
The key is to isolate the problem. I mean, we see a lot of people starting to program, they write the function and it doesn't work, and the response is, well, it doesn't work. And their intuition is to start over or kind of just become frustrated, which it is frustrating. And so you really got to start printing out your variables as you go through. I know that this should equal this, and kind of look into.
You want to be systematic, like where people get frustrated and it doesn't work to solve the problem is usually if you start trying random things and seeing if it works, and that's tempting because it is frustrating when it doesn't work, but that rarely helps you solve the problem. That it's much better to try to be systematic and do things in small steps.